Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor, Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our guest today is Will Toffan. A retired history teacher and veteran of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, William Toffan lives in Windsor, Ontario with his wife, Laura, and children Lauren, Heidi, Oksana, and Heather. Published by Biblioasis in the fall of 2020, his first book is Watching the Devil Dance: How a Spree Killer Slipped Through the Cracks of the Criminal Justice System. Welcome, Will Toffan.
Thank you very much. I'm proud to be here.
So you've had a varied career. You've been a history teacher and a police officer. When and how did you first discover your passion for writing?
I used to do it. I guess it would probably go back to when I was in the RCMP. I was stationed in along Highway 16 in northern BC, which is today known as the Highway of Tears. It's somewhat notorious for the 50-odd women that have been subjected to serial sexual predators since about 1971. And I worked one of the first cases. Mind you, I was a junior man, but I worked one of the first cases, the death of Monica Agnes. But at that time, when we were going through this, basically this trauma in that particular area of BC in the early 70s, mid 70s, I started a detachment newspaper just for the morale of the police officers, the RCMP officers. So as far as writing goes, it probably goes back to that. So everyone really liked the newspaper. I thought I was a very good writer. I hadn't even been to college yet at the time, so I didn't think I was very good. But I went back, and of course, I got my postgraduate degrees. And so that's how I came into writing. I'm writing a lot of history papers. If you've been through grad school, as probably most of you have, you know you do a lot of papers. You do a writing, whether you like it or not, you get better at it.
Well, what's your writing process? Is there a certain place where you prefer to write? Is there a particular time of day?
I'm a night writer. Usually, I wrote right here in my little office room here. This is where I wrote the book. It was almost a 6-year project because in addition to, of course, secondary source material like researching old newspaper articles, journal articles, peer-reviewed articles. The book is quite wide in the scope as to the material it covers, but it was the primary sources that I did a lot of personal interviews. And because of my police background, I was very fortunate. I had a lot of with the local police and a lot of the inspectors and detectives that have originally worked the case I'm writing about, the Matthew Lamb, Canada's first spree killing case. So I was very fortunate. So they took me in, and so I had easy access to a lot of important people who really had some insight on the case that was never released to the newspapers or the magazines that would write about this case back in the day when it happened. 66, and again in 1976, 10 years after the killings that took place here in Windsor, the assailant, Matthew Charles Lamb, received international media attention again because his release from the Oak Ridge facility for the criminally insane, after he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, he was sent to the Oak Ridge facility, which I write in the book, I dedicate a chapter to. At the time, was undergoing very strange experiments using CIA techniques to try and cure psychopathy. The doctor that was in charge of the medical unit there, T. Elliot Barker, had a theory that he could cure psychopaths. He believed that beneath an exterior was a hidden psychosis in every psychopath, that there was an incident somewhere in their childhood so horrific or so traumatizing that they have subconsciously suppressed it, and that led them into psychopathic behavior. And he thought by a very disciplined, very structured, disciplined environment, but one with the very wide use of hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, scopolamine, which was, of course, a Nazi truth serum invented by the Nazis, a truth serum, sodium amytal, all these drugs. He believed that he could send psychopaths on a journey of self-discovery, and that in this process, they would be able to, this hidden psychosis would suddenly manifest itself. They would see it, they could target it, they could eliminate it, and thus bring the psychopath back to sanity. Of course, it was nonsense. It didn't work. It was a horrific program. In fact, 20 of the people that were subjected to it recently in 2018 were awarded a substantial amount of money by the province of Ontario for suing a class action suit against fellows that were interned with Matthew Charles Lamb during the 60s and early 70s. They won a class action suit, and it was determined that they had been tortured by the province of Ontario. And it's quite a horrific read of what they were actually doing there. But of course, his crime was even more horrific.
It's a fascinating story. If we can go back to the beginning where he committed the crime, it was a sweltering evening in June of 1966. He was 18, and Matthew Charles Lamb stole a double-barreled shotgun and some ammunition from his uncle. Then he walked down Ford Boulevard, which we know is a quiet residential street here in Windsor, and shot several strangers. You had a personal connection to one of his victims. Can you tell us about that connection and your inspiration for writing the book?
Yeah, I was 12 years old, and I lived on Gladstone Avenue here in Windsor, which is another working class neighborhood. And next door to me, a family moved in, and the 19-year-old daughter was Edith Tchaikovsky, and I was 12, and I had this mad crush on her. And I made friends with her little brother, who was very nice, but it wasn't really him I was really interested in. I was really just trying to get her to notice me. So I really had this crush on this 20-year-old woman, and they moved away. And then about 3 months after they moved away from my neighborhood, she was the first one to be shotgunned to death at the hands of Matthew Charles Lamb.
Oh my gosh. Well, in light of that personal connection and the impact it had on your life, what was the process of researching and writing the book like for you?
Well, the story had always stuck with me because it was traumatizing for me. I was 12 years old, and I think that death, I had seen, when you're 12 years old, you understand death and then the finality of it, but it's usually in your grandparents and older people, and you come to accept that. But when you see a young teenage person, especially someone that you had a crush on, it's a real eye opener. You realize the world isn't the world you thought it was. And as I mentioned in the preface to the book, I really believe it was her death, and of course the death of the other deaths as well, but primarily her death that led me to become a police officer and an RCMP officer in the first place. I never would have considered it, but I realized that the world wasn't the safe place I once thought it was. And that I really believe that it was her death that compelled me to initially join the RCMP when I was 19.
Wow. I've got to tell you, I grew up in East Windsor, and I'm back in East Windsor. I'm probably 3.5 kilometers from where all of this took place. And I knew nothing about this until
you're younger than I am. You're really young.
But even so, there's mythology that develops, in your hometown. And this just went really quiet. In the book, you talk about the fact that Matthew Charles Lamb's killing spree shocked the nation, that there was all this media coverage. Your bibliography clearly shows how much press coverage there was back in 1966. Yet today, his name and his crimes have fallen into relative obscurity, were it not for your book. I polled some friends that are also East Windsorites. They didn't know about this. Why do you suppose that the story of Lamb has not been better known, even in Windsor, Ontario, where the murders happened?
I've asked myself that question many times because it did receive a wide degree of coverage, and it wasn't just like through the Windsor media. It was the American media, like the regional, like Detroit covered it. They covered the murders. They covered the trial. Toronto covered the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star. But in those days, as for Windsorites, I can't speak to why it. I know with a lot of people. I mean, when this book went on sale, they initially printed out 500 copies, and within 2 days, I just went to the producer or to the publisher, and the publisher said, "We just punched out another 500, another 1,000 books because there was a real demand for the book." So obviously, there were people that obviously remembered it and knew the story or parts of it. But you're right. I mean, there's a lot of people that just have forgotten. And I guess again, the story wasn't resuscitated until 10 years later. With Matthew Charles Lamb's death in Rhodesia by military friendly fire. That brought the story up again. I mean, it even went to the Canadian Parliament. as to how, I mean, a lot of questions were asked as how was a man just recently released as a criminally insane mass murderer, how was he able to get his passport twice? He was to get it renewed while he's still an inmate at Oak Ridge, which at that point was the most dangerous facility, or held the most dangerous people in the country. And those, you gotta, one thing I mentioned too, I used a lot of pop cultural references in the book because I did some of my graduate work in the history of popular culture. And popular culture played a big role in it. 60s were a very turbulent time, especially like 66. We were breaking out of what I would call the 1950s social mores, those highly structured social attitudes and social rules that we all abided by. I mean, Betty Friedan had Betty Friedan had led in 1963. She had done the feminine mystique, so you had the rise of the women, first stage of women's liberation. We had racial division in the United States, and of course, Windsor being right next to Detroit, we were just inundated with that information. Very similar to today in many ways. But so there was a lot of things starting to happen at that time. But in 1966, it was still very sedate. This is a very safe place. Spree killers were virtually unheard of. And I know the publisher, they put on the cover of the book, the story of Windsor, or the Canada's first spree killer. And I think that's true. I mean, I did background search. I even went to the RCMP, a lot of my old buddies that put in 30, 40 years. Nobody could find a case like it, like that could predate 1966. And to me, he was a message. He was an omen of things to come, because that was a very strange summer. We had the lowest homicide statistics since World War II. And yet in a 2-month period, you had Matthew Charles Lamb here in Windsor go on a shooting spree. Then in Chicago, you had Richard Speck, who murdered 8 nurses. You probably know the story. I know Netflix has done a thing on it. The media in the United States called it the crime of the century. And then a month after him, Charles Joseph Whitman ascended the Bell Tower at the University of Austin in Texas and shot 45 people. And these today, that we wouldn't, that would be in the news maybe for a couple, it would be 2 cycles of the news and it would be forgotten. But back then, these were revelations. These were not types of crimes people saw. It was just, we couldn't really wrap our heads around these types of killers because it was murder without motive. And that's what spree killers are. It's murders without motive. And Matthew Lamb, and we started to see more of it in Canada in the 1980s, the media started calling them Rambo attacks because around 1985, 1986, we saw a few of these, mostly teenage boys, about Matthew Lamb's age, going out on these killing sprees. And again, without any apparent motive. And there had been that movie by Sylvester Stallone, Rambo, where this disgruntled Vietnam vet, a very honorable man, is shunned by the society he comes back to, and he shoots up the town, because they disrespected him, and so that's why the media called them Rambo attacks. And but of course now, since the beginning of the 21st century, they've just really, really multiplied these shootings. As you know, I mean, it's every week in the United States. It's either a school or a shopping mall. People aren't even paying attention. We've shamefully accepted it as a negative part of our contemporary culture. But back then, it was unheard of. And that's why it was such a strange case. And even when it went to trial, and back then it was a hanging offense. Capital murder wasn't eliminated until 1976 in Canada. So in 66, Matthew Lamb was facing the noose. And for his lawyer, Saul Nosenchuk, who would become a magistrate here in Windsor, and a good one, he defended him as a young defense attorney on the not guilty by reason of insanity defense, which is the toughest defense to prove. But he had a lot of things going his way. One, this was such a bizarre crime at the time. Like today, he would be convicted. He would never get away with an insanity offense. Just like Justin Bork 2 years ago out in Nova Scotia, he killed 5 Mounties. He painted his car to look like a police car and he went around shooting policemen. Well, that's really the type of spree killer, even a smaller subset from that mass murdering type is the urban subcommando. And that's really what Matthew Lamb was. He was one of the first, if not the first, urban subcommando that we've seen so many times since then.
In your book,
Yeah, sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, does that answer your question or?
It does. It does. I mean, I think that we sort of lose track of crimes that are less horrific or less shocking in time as more and more of them pile on top of each other.
Yeah.
But at the time, this was very, very shocking, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we've become somewhat climatized or acclimated to these types of killers, but back then it was a real revelation. And the outcome of the trial itself was very important because it changed the Canadian Criminal Code's version of or interpretation of criminal insanity. We had always, like the British, we had always operated under what was known as the MacNaughton rule. And that was a very strict definition of not criminally responsible, what constituted someone who's guilty and isn't, but or is not guilty by reason of insanity. And that changed. It was that case, that was the case precedent that led to our change to the Durham rule, which was a much more liberal, a more expansive interpretation of what criminal insanity means. Because insanity is not a medical term, it's a legal term. There's nothing in the the DSM manual for the psychologists for something called insanity. It's strictly a legal term.
In your book, Watching the Devil Dance, you focus extensively on the aftermath, as you're mentioning, of the crime, and the killer's rather unusual experiences in the psychiatric facility, his life on the outside afterwards. You've touched on that. Without giving too much away, no spoilers, can you tell us a little bit about why it was so important for you to explore what happened to this man, or what didn't happen after the killings?
Yeah, I think, I wanted to tell this case from beginning to end because there was a lot of misinformation here about for the people that do remember what happened, nobody really understood what had happened afterwards. Everyone assumed, including the detectives from the Windsor Police Force, that Matthew Lamb would rot in Oak Ridge facility. He would be there basically for life because up until the late 60s, Oak Ridge facility had never released a murderer, ever. But by the late 1960s, that had completely turned around. With T. Elliott Barker coming in, it became much of a catch, treat, and release program. And the counterculture, was a period in the 60s, late 60s, where we were starting to question the efficacy of all our state institutions, right? And the legal system was not unaffected by that. And so rehabilitation became that was the catchword of the day. For Matthew Charles Lamb he committed these crimes at a very inconvenient time because rehabilitation was in the air, and as a better outcome, say, than long prison terms or long terms in psychiatric facilities. We really, it was a time where we were our professionals in the psychiatric field and in the medical field were theorizing and experimenting where anything was possible, including curing psychopathy, because we didn't really understand the disorder that well back then. So, nobody could really say whether these programs were right or wrong or had any validity to them or not, because we just didn't know. So it was a time of experimentation, and Matthew Lamb just got caught up in all this.
You did a great deal of research for this project, including a number of interviews with survivors and family members and police officers, lawyers, and others who were affected by the crimes. Have you received any feedback from these people about your book?
Yes. In fact, I'm so glad you asked me that, because one of the greatest benefits I received from this project was that in 1966, when these killings took place, only 2 of the survivors actually kept in touch with each other over the years. I talk about this in the book. And if you read the book, Grace Dunlop was shot through the front door of her home. He just went on a killing spree. But none of them had kept in contact with each other afterwards. It was just like a horrific event, and everyone just split up. And no one had talked to each other in the last 55 years. And then when the book was released, they contact me, then they all started getting in contact with each other. In fact, one of the 18-year-old girl, Grace Dunlop, who was shot point blank through her open screen door that night, she called me. She lives in Florida now, and she called me, and she got in touch with all the other people that survived, all the other survivors, as well as the family, the Tchaikovsky families, the survivors that were not killed but were hurt in the attack, that were shot but survived. They've all gotten together, they've had dinner together, they've written, they talked to each other. And to me, that was probably the best outcome possible, because they had all been suffering in silence. And that's one of the biggest outtakes I take from this book, that long after the trials, long after the punishment of the criminal, the pain lives on. It's the survivors who carry this with them for the rest of their lives. They carry that, like the Tchaikovsky family carried a common neurosis. It's a post-offense neurosis where they feared the killer is going to come back someday. That even though he's been, and in this case, this really happened. Their wish or their fears did come true. It's in the book, but that's a very, very common neurosis. The fear that somehow that killer, if he's not executed, is somehow going to get free and come back for some sort of revenge, say on the rest of the family or on other survivors. And they've all lived with this, and it's all affected them. It's affected them deeply throughout their lives. And so when the book came out, and they all read it, and they all really liked it, and they all got in touch with each other. And it's been some of the very cathartic for the survivors. So I couldn't ask for anything better than that.
My goodness, that is very impressive. I mean, you talk in the book about the fact that not only these survivors and their families, but even the police officers who were on the scene didn't really have access to the kind of counseling that people would have available now. So how great that your book was able to promote some level of healing for some of these folks.
Thank you. I tried to make a point that I wasn't going, because true crime, I mean, this is my first true crime book, although I've always been a aficionado of it, and plus I was an investigator at the RCP, so obviously I don't like crime or reading about it, but it has an exploitative aspect to it. So, and I really made a point to avoid that. So as horrific as the murders were, and I go into a lot of details to, like, minute by minute what transpired, or second by second, but without ever exploiting or ever trying to, trying to exploit in any way, or to make it more fascinating or titillating. I didn't do that, and I was really glad that it turned out. And a lot of the reviews I've gotten, all my reviews have been really good, and a lot of the reviewers have mentioned that. But there was no, I didn't do it at anyone's expense, so I was really proud of that.
That's wonderful. So we've talked a bit about how those readers that were affected by this story have approached the book. What do you most hope that other readers who are approaching this topic without prior knowledge or a personal connection will take away from the book?
Well, there's a lot of sub-themes to the book. I of course, being an author, I read my own reviews, right? And what I've really liked is the fact that this book is basically about one of Canada's first spree killer, and what happened to him, and what happened to the people he shot, and so the survivors, and of course the ones that didn't survive. That's the main theme of the book. But there's a lot of sub themes I've woven into this book as well, and like I say, a lot of pop cultural references, which really, and the changing times. They were a very tumultuous period, late 60s, early 70s. So they played a major role as well. I'm sorry, you have to forgive me, I forget the question.
So what are you hoping that other readers, those who are new to this material, will take away from the book?
It's a snapshot in time. For all the talk about, everyone talk about this, the great 60s, everyone talks about the 60s. There's very little research, very little history about that period, I found. And especially when it comes to true crime. Usually starts in the 70s when you see these serial killers start to really manifest themselves, especially in the United States. And I thought it was a very important piece of Canadian history. I think they will get that, and it was, and they'll get a real understanding and and I believe it's written so that you don't have to have any legal knowledge in order to really appreciate it, but just how the legal system worked back then and how it dealt with a type of offender that they had not previously seen. So it's a snapshot in history, and it's also just a personal reflection of growing up in that period, of growing up in the 60s. And I think from the reviews I've gotten, they've all gotten a different piece. They've all taken a different lesson from the book. They later talk about how this, I show a lot of empathy towards victims and what happened to them. Other ones will take the fact, or have taken away the fact that about our medical system with respect to people who suffer from criminal mental illness and crimes. I don't know. There's a lot of things in the book. I think that I don't know, but based on the reviews, everyone finds a little something in there that they found really interesting. So I think it's a good history book, and it's just a period. It's a snapshot in time, a painful snapshot in time of what otherwise was a very joyful period. And the 60s were a great time for growing up in that period. Growing up in the 60s, I mean, we all look back with rose-tinted glasses on our childhoods, but I think the 60s were a great time to grow up in. But they were also a tumultuous time, much more difficult on the adults who understood the world more than the young people like us. But I mean, we had the great music, we had the Beatles, we had the rock revolution. There was a lot of things going on, and it was a great time to grow up. But it was also a time that of just change, large change, great change, societal change. Our social mores, our social attitudes were being questioned, and were changing, and like it or not. I mean, it was a wild time.
You mentioned that this was your first true crime book. Do you have another one in the works? What's your next project?
I do. And originally, I was going to do 3 cases from this area, but the Matthew Lamb case, Watching the Devil Dance, was just such a unique case in its own right that it was a book on its own. But there are 2 other homicides that took place in Windsor. Where are you ladies? Are you from Windsor? I'm sorry. Are you from Windsor? Do you know?
We all live in Windsor, yeah.
Well, I spent a lot of research on the Luca Topic case, the 6-year-old who was murdered on Drouillard Road in May of 1971. In fact, her case was just resolved about a year and a half ago through DNA. They found out the perpetrator had passed away, I believe in 2017, but they found through the DNA that he was the one responsible. But they never released the name. So I spent a lot of time researching the Topic case because it was one of the oldest cold case files on child homicide in Canada. It was over 50 years before we solved it. And also the death of another Windsor girl in the Riverside area here, Veronica Quint, who was murdered in October 26th of 1970. Just meters from her home, she was raped and murdered just about 50 feet from the front door with her parents waiting for her. It was a horrible story. But you know what? I'm reluctant to proceed on it because I have to ask myself this question, because a lot of their families are still surviving. I have to ask, I'm sorry, but I have to ask myself this question: am I serving a purpose other than just detailing true or some interesting stories or true crime that would appeal to people who like reading true crime? Am I providing any service, or am I just hurting people who are still surviving and don't want to relive those times? I just don't know. I can't say to myself there's a larger lesson in it. I'm trying to find that. And if I can justify that, I've put in a lot of work and I'll go to print with it. But I just haven't found that hook or that sense of peace that this book should be out there for other people to read about other people's pain without a greater social message or some greater good that would come out of publishing that material. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the only thing that's holding me back on that right now. So if I can convince myself that I'm serving a greater purpose by letting more people learn about those particular homicides, then I'll definitely have it published.
Well, that's an admirable goal, and we hope you find that nugget that makes the story work for you. So, would you like to read something from your current book for our listeners?
Sure. Sure, I guess. I'm not sure. I don't have any favorite parts. I like the whole book, but all right. Well, I'll read just the opening of chapter 6, which is titled "Watching the Devil Dance." There's a long story behind that, but all right, I'll go ahead. 2 days after blasting his way into Canadian criminal history, Matthew Charles Lamb appeared before Windsor's magistrate court with only the judge, court stenographer, a single reporter from the Windsor Star, and arresting officer, Detective Sergeant Jim Muir, in attendance. Court proceedings were surreptitiously moved up an hour earlier than scheduled to avoid a crowd of curious spectators and media hounds ready to cover the sensational crime for their newspapers or to pad television ratings. Everyone was anxious for a glimpse of the young man who 2 days earlier gunned down 4 innocent strangers in the residential Windsor neighborhood for no apparent reason. Lamb sat alone on a long wooden bench in the prisoner's dock, usually filled with detainees awaiting their turn to shuffle up before the presiding judge to hear their charges read and court dates set. Lamb's body language and loud audible yawns articulated his indifference toward the court proceedings. Handcuffed and brought before the magistrate, Lamb was charged with the capital murder of Edith Tchaikovsky, a crime carrying a mandatory death sentence upon conviction. Capital punishment would not be abolished in Canada until 1976, a decade later. The magistrate ordered a standard pretrial psychiatric examination to determine Lamb's mental state.
Well, thank you for joining us, Will Toffan. The book is Watching the Devil Dance, How a Spree Killer Slipped Through the Cracks of the Criminal Justice System. And we so appreciate your being with us today.
I so appreciate you inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.